Hi everyone, it's Lauren, and these are the reviews for the books that I've read in the second half of March. If you'd like to see what I read in the first half of March, I'll leave my review linked up here and in the description box below, whereas always all links to any books mentioned are as well if you'd like to go and check them out for yourself. So, an interesting little group of books that I read this month. The first of these is Folk by Zoe Gilbert. Now this book has been getting some quite mixed reviews, and I am very sorry to say that I am someone who really didn't like it in the end. At first, I really thought I was going to enjoy it, and then once I got over halfway through, I actually put it down because I'm of the opinion that life is too short, and even, you know, if you give it a good 100 or so pages and you're not enjoying it, I think that's okay to just admit defeat and put it down. This is essentially a collection of short stories rather than a novel, and it's set on the fictional island of Neverness, where lots of magical, mystical, fairy tale-esque happenings go on. For example, there's a young boy who's born and instead of an arm he has a wing. There's a character in here who very much resembles a Selkie, and there's lots of talks about witchcraft and superstition, and a lot of the same characters reappear in different stories, and kind of as you read them you piece together the lives of this village community. Unfortunately, because so many of the ideas are so fantastical and magical, I struggled to follow kind of what exactly the kind of picture Zoe Gilbert was trying to paint. It very much felt like she had all these ideas and she was jumping to the ends of stories or kind of referring back to the beginnings and trying to make little implications, but it just wasn't clear enough for me to really understand where she was going. It almost felt like she was going at a different speed that I couldn't follow. So in the end I just felt like I wasn't kind of along on the journey with her. But having said that, this is her first book, this is her first collection, and although this one is quite messy, I feel like there's quite a lot in there in her writing. Perhaps it just needs a bit of refining or some fine-tuning, and I would definitely pick her up again. Next, I was very happy to be sent an advanced copy of Sarah Moss's new book by Granta, and that is Ghost Wall. I have read, I think, now I've read every other fiction book that Sarah Moss has written. I've certainly read and loved The Tidal Zone, which was out a couple of years ago, and this book is out in September. This is quite interesting. On reading this, I mean, it's a novella really, it's very short, but I feel like every book that I've read by her is so different, and yet at the same time I can really tell that it's been written by the same person, because she tackles very different subjects, but they all have this leaning towards history and academia and learning, and feminism is also very present in her novels as well. So it's very interesting kind of seeing this come together. This book is about a family, it's about a young girl and her father and mother who are going on to an archaeological, I suppose it's a project or an experiment with some students and a professor from a nearby university, and they're living as Iron Age settlers in the north of England. So they've built a roundhouse, they're learning how to hunt and gather food and berries, and they're trying to kind of live as close to that time as they possibly can do. At the same time, there are some very interesting family dynamics happening between Sylvie's father and her mother, and there's definitely a lot of physical and emotional abuse kind of happening within that family unit, and that situation is tied back to the bodies that are found in bogs, kind of the Iron Age sacrificial bodies which have been found and preserved, and it's looking at that time in history and trying to understand why people's very treasured possessions and other human life was sacrificed to these peat bogs, and kind of why that might have been. And it's a very interesting book. She again manages to pack so many different themes and observations into an even shorter book this time. In terms of enjoyment of the actual story, this was quite an interesting one for me, because as I was reading it, I was thinking, yeah, this is fine, I'm interested, I want to see how it's going to unfold, and Sylvie is quite an interesting narrator. I was really empathising with her situation. And at the end of it, I think it almost snuck up on me how emotionally involved I was, because I didn't really feel that with a lot of passion as I was reading through it. But by the end, I was just like, oh my God, I was so into it. And it has stayed with me quite a lot. I think it raises some really interesting points without necessarily being a super kind of action-packed book. There's a lot of interesting things in there. So I would recommend picking this up when this comes out in September, especially if you're new to Sarah Moss actually. It's quite an interesting easy first read. And the final book I finished this month was The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, and I absolutely adored it. I'm so pleased that I finally got around to this book. This is less a novel and more a series of stories again, actually. The story centres around 4 different Chinese women who are all immigrants to the United States, and their 4 adult daughters who have been born and raised in California. And there is an element of plot where one of the daughters, June, her mother dies, and so when this happens she goes and joins the mahjong group, which is called the Joy Luck Club, with the other 3 women, her mother's friends. But that really is a springboard into a whole series of stories where these women are kind of narrating in first person their lives, basically their childhoods in China and perhaps what drove them to emigrate. And then we also get some stories from the daughters themselves, and it's about the relationships between the daughters and the mothers, but more than that, it's the 2 cultures, the Chinese culture, the American culture, and how that there's always a bit of a mistranslation between what the mothers believe and understand and what the daughters kind of want from their lives. And it's so interesting and so beautiful and so readable. And I particularly loved the use of storytelling and the fact that the way these women were talking about these lives, particularly the mothers, it really had that feeling of a kind of mystic Chinese fairy tale or bedtime story. And it's very similar actually to The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston, which kind of makes sense. That's also about a kind of 2nd generation Chinese immigrant daughter, and she's telling the story of her mother. And I absolutely love that book, and so I'm really pleased that I picked this one up as well, because they're quite similar and I loved it as well. One thing I would say is that I struggled to remember which mother was the mother of which daughter and whose stories were whose as I was reading, but I think that's because I was reading it on my Kindle, and there is a list of the mothers and daughters at the beginning of the book, but I couldn't really flick back to look at that, so that might have been the reason for that. But it almost felt like that didn't really matter, and it wasn't important whose stories belonged to which character. It was more like, this is the story of women in China, and then this is the story of women growing up in the US, and it just all flowed together in a really beautiful way. And it just really hit upon those complicated emotions that sometimes exist between family members, where there is obviously love there, but also that's mixed with sadness and disappointment and jealousy and resentment, and it's all kind of mixed together. And perhaps some things are left unsaid, but the meaning is always there. Yeah, just a really beautiful book. Really pleased that I read it and would absolutely recommend it. So that's it from me for this month. I would love to hear what you've been reading in March, or if you've got any opinions on these books, if you've already read them. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!